Bobby Bare, country music's outlaw storyteller, a man who carved his own path through Nashville with raw honesty and unforgettable songs. Now at 90 years old, the Grand Ole Opry legend isn't holding back. For decades, fans wondered what he really thought about his peers on country's biggest stage. But in a stunning turn, Bobby Bare finally named the 7 Opry artists he hated working with, and the stories behind his confessions will leave you shocked. When you think of Bobby Bare, one image immediately comes to mind: the outlaw with a guitar slung across his shoulder, a voice steeped in grit and truth, and a heart that never quite conformed to the Nashville machine. While many Grand Ole Opry performers leaned into polish, charm, and the wholesome family image the institution wanted to project, Bare stood apart. He wasn't there to play a role. He was there to tell stories, and those stories often carried the raw weight of real life. Born in 1935, Bare grew up with music as both salvation and rebellion. His early life was marked by struggle, poverty, personal loss, and the kind of hardships that gave his songs their emotional edge. When he broke into the country scene in the 1960s, Nashville was at a crossroads. Some artists leaned toward the slick Nashville sound, while others wanted to keep country music raw and authentic. Bobby Bare fell firmly into the latter camp. He didn't just sing songs, he lived them. His breakthrough hit, Detroit City, wasn't a glossy anthem. It was the lament of a man who longed for home while being trapped in the grind of northern industry. This honesty was Bare's greatest gift, but it was also what set him at odds with the Grand Ole Opry establishment. The Opry was, in many ways, a sacred institution, part performance, part tradition, and part political machine. For some artists, it was a place of honor, but also of compromise. Smiles had to be constant, decorum maintained, and rivalries hidden behind backstage curtains. Bare never played that game. He was blunt, unfiltered, and unafraid to voice his opinions, even if it meant stepping on a few cowboy boots. While fans adored him for that very reason, his fellow Opry members weren't always as forgiving. Bare could be dismissive of artists he thought were insincere, manufactured, or too eager to please the Nashville executives who pulled the strings. To Bobby, country music was supposed to be about truth, not business deals. That philosophy, noble though it was, created tension. Some artists saw him as rebellious. Others saw him as arrogant. Either way, Bobby Bare was never just another Opry member. But here's the thing about the Grand Ole Opry. Beneath the bright stage lights and smiling performances, it was a place full of rivalries. Egos clashed, styles conflicted, and politics dictated who rose and who fell. Behind the curtains, the Opry could be as cutthroat as any Hollywood studio. And Bobby Bare, with his refusal to bite his tongue, became both admired and resented. By the time he entered his later years, Bare had built a reputation for candor. He wasn't the type to keep quiet, especially when asked about his experiences with fellow performers. Fans loved this about him, because when Bobby spoke, he spoke with the authority of a man who had lived through the heart of country music's golden age. So when, at the age of 90, Bobby Bare began naming names, the artists he hated, the revelations didn't just shock country fans. They rocked the very foundations of the Opry's carefully preserved image. In a way, it made sense. Bare had reached an age where he no longer had anything to lose. His legacy was secure, his influence undeniable, and his honesty sharper than ever. For decades, whispers had floated through Nashville about who he didn't get along with. But hearing the names confirmed by Bare himself was something entirely different. It wasn't gossip anymore, it was confession. And that confession is where our story begins. Because as we peel back the curtain of the Grand Ole Opry, we discover that Bobby Bare's truth wasn't just about the songs he sang, it was about the people he couldn't stand. And the list, as we'll see, includes 7 names that will shock even the most devoted fans of country music. The Grand Ole Opry has long been portrayed as a family, one big, happy gathering of artists who loved each other, supported one another, and worked together to keep country music alive. But anyone who spent time behind those velvet curtains knows the truth. The Opry was also a stage for competition, politics, and quiet rivalries. Friendships were real, yes, but so were grudges. Artists fought for stage time, for recognition, and for favor with executives who controlled radio play and record deals. Bobby Bare saw this all with clear eyes. To him, the Opry wasn't a perfect family. It was a business, and often a ruthless one. And while Bare could laugh off a lot of the backstage drama, there were certain artists whose behavior, in his mind, crossed the line. At 90 years old, he didn't mince words. When asked who he truly hated, he didn't hesitate to name names. The first came as a surprise to many fans: Porter Hale. Though never quite as famous as a Johnny Cash or a Hank Williams Jr., Hale had carved out a respectable career in the 1970s and 80s with polished, radio-friendly hits. To the audience, he was charming, always smiling and always dressed in rhinestones. But Bare saw something else. He believed Hale was everything wrong with Nashville, a man more concerned with image than authenticity. According to Bare, Hale often treated the Opry less like a stage for storytelling and more like a platform for self-promotion. In one interview, Bare recalled a backstage encounter where Hale bragged endlessly about his record sales, dismissing other artists as outdated and forgettable. To Bobby, this wasn't just arrogance, it was disrespect. Country music wasn't about ego, it was about truth and connection. And while Bare could joke with the best of them, he had no patience for people who dismissed the art form in favor of their own pride. "I couldn't stand him," Bare admitted bluntly. "He was everything I hated about the industry: phony smiles, empty songs, and a heart that didn't beat for country music." The second name Bobby Bare dropped was even more shocking: Evelyn Sharp, one of the few women in the Opry ranks during Bare's early years. On stage, Evelyn projected a wholesome, sweet image that audiences adored. But offstage, Bare claimed she was manipulative and ruthless. According to him, she played the political game with precision, cozying up to Opry executives and leveraging friendships to secure prime stage slots. Bare recalled one particular night in the late 1960s when he was scheduled for a key performance slot, only to find himself bumped last minute. The reason? Evelyn had convinced management that she deserved the spot more, citing her new single as more relevant. For Bare, it wasn't just a professional slight. It was a betrayal of the camaraderie that artists were supposed to share. He resented what he saw as a pattern: Evelyn smiling in public while scheming in private. Fans were stunned when Bare mentioned her name. To them, she was a pioneer, a beloved performer who helped pave the way for women in country music. But Bare didn't care about reputation. He cared about truth. "She wasn't who the audience thought she was," he said with a grim chuckle. "And I never forgave her for the way she treated people behind the curtain." By naming Porter Hale and Evelyn Sharp, Bobby Bare shattered the illusion of harmony at the Opry. He reminded fans that even the brightest stages cast long shadows. And if these were just the first two names, one couldn't help but wonder, who else was on his list? By the time Bobby Bare revealed the first two names, fans were already reeling. Porter Hale, the rhinestone cowboy of the 70s, and Evelyn Sharp, the sweetheart with a sharp edge, both exposed by Bare as phonies in his eyes. But the real shock came when he continued down the list. With each name, he peeled back another layer of the Opry's carefully maintained image, showing just how messy life behind the curtain could be. The third name Bare dropped was Ray Steele Collins, a guitarist known for his flashy solos and his reputation for drinking too much before shows. Bare had little patience for Collins' antics. On one infamous night in the mid-70s, Bare remembered Collins stumbling onto the Opry stage, slurring his way through a performance that embarrassed not just himself, but the institution. "He made a mockery of the stage," Bare said. "That stage meant something, and he didn't respect it." Bare's disdain wasn't just about professionalism, it was about honor. To him, Collins was the kind of performer who thought talent excused arrogance and recklessness. The fourth name was Linda Rayburn, a singer-songwriter who leaned heavily into sentimental ballads. To many, she was a beloved voice of the Opry's family-friendly side. To Bare, she represented the opposite of what country music was supposed to be. He felt her songs were manufactured, designed more for commercial success than for truth. She sang about heartbreak like it was something you read in a book, Bear scoffed. But country music ain't supposed to be fiction. It's supposed to be life. Their personal clashes backstage only deepened the divide, with Bear accusing her of looking down on the outlaw crowd he represented. Number 5 on his list was the one that drew gasps even from insiders: Tommy Tex Dobbs. Dobbs was a traditionalist, fiercely loyal to the Opry and resistant to any kind of change. Where Bear embraced pushing boundaries, experimenting with folk, rock, and even spoken-word storytelling, Dobbs saw it as betrayal. The two clashed repeatedly over the direction of country music. Bear once recalled an argument where Dobbs sneered, "You're trying to ruin the Opry with your nonsense." Bear never forgave him for it. Tex wasn't just stubborn, Bear explained. He was hateful. He thought tradition gave him the right to decide what country music should be, and I hated that. The 6th name was Carlton Briggs, a man Bear described as the slickest snake in Nashville. Briggs had a reputation for cutting backroom deals, using connections with managers and radio executives to boost his career while undercutting others. Bear claimed that Briggs once took a song idea he'd heard Bobby humming backstage and later recorded something eerily similar without acknowledgement. He was a thief in cowboy boots, Bear said. To him, there was nothing worse than dishonesty in the art. And then came the 7th and final name, Margaret Maggs Holloway. Of all the artists Bear mentioned, this one carried the most bitterness. Holloway had been a rising star in the late 60s, known for her fiery personality and bold stage presence. But behind the scenes, Bear claimed she was vindictive. He remembered a night when Holloway spread a rumor that Bear was quitting the Opry, a lie that caused him a storm of questions and nearly cost him his slot. "She wanted me out," Bear said flatly, "and I never forgave her for it." To him, Holloway embodied the cutthroat side of the Opry, where ambition outweighed loyalty. By the end of his list, Bobby Bear had painted a picture of an Opry far different from the one fans saw on television. It wasn't just rhinestones and harmony, it was rivalries, grudges, and broken trust. For Bear, naming these 7 wasn't about revenge, it was about truth. And for fans, hearing those names from his own mouth felt like history finally being written without the gloss of Nashville PR. By the time Bobby Bear turned 90, most artists of his generation had either retired quietly or faded into nostalgic legend. But Bear had never been one to stay quiet. Even as age slowed him down, his wit remained sharp, his honesty unfiltered. When asked why he chose to reveal the names of the 7 Grand Ole Opry artists he hated most, Bear chuckled. "At 90, what do I got to lose? They can't fire me now." To him, the list wasn't about bitterness, it was about setting the record straight. For decades, the Opry had been packaged as a shining beacon of unity, a place where stars gathered in harmony to celebrate country music. Bear wanted people to know that wasn't the full story. "I loved the Opry," he clarified, "but don't think for a second it was perfect. We fought, we clashed, and some folks, well, I just plain couldn't stand them." Fans' reactions were mixed. Some applauded Bear's courage, praising him for pulling back the curtain on an institution that had long been romanticized. Younger audiences, in particular, admired his candor. Here was a man who had nothing left to prove, speaking truths others were too afraid to say. But others were shocked, even disappointed. To them, hearing Bear disparage artists they had grown up idolizing felt like watching a childhood hero throw stones at the family portrait. Bear didn't mind the criticism. In fact, he expected it. "Truth ain't always pretty," he said, "but it's still the truth." He emphasized that his disdain for those 7 artists wasn't about tearing down the Opry. It was about showing that real art is messy, that even legends carried grudges and imperfections. "If you think we all held hands and sang songs like a church choir," Bear laughed, "you've been watching the wrong show." As he reflected, Bear also acknowledged that time had softened some of his anger. Looking back, he admitted that maybe some of the grudges weren't worth holding. Ray Steele Collins, for example, had passed away years earlier, and Bear admitted he sometimes regretted not making peace. "But then again," he added, "he was drunk half the time, so maybe it wouldn't have mattered." The humor was classic Bobby Bear. biting but honest, never cruel for the sake of cruelty. In many ways, the list revealed as much about Bear as it did about the artists he named. It showed his deep respect for authenticity, his disdain for arrogance, and his refusal to compromise his values. Where others played politics to climb higher, Bear stuck to his guns. He valued truth over polish, grit over glamour, and honesty over diplomacy. That's why fans loved him, and why, even in his 90s, people still wanted to hear what he had to say. His revelations also sparked a broader conversation about the Opry itself. Was the institution truly the sacred hall it claimed to be, or was it just another stage where egos clashed and ambitions collided? Bear's honesty forced fans to reconsider what it meant to be a part of country music's most hallowed tradition. For some, it made the Opry seem more human, flawed, but real. For others, it was a painful reminder that legends are, at the end of the day, just people with tempers and grudges. As Bobby Bear sat back, reflecting on 90 years of life, he left fans with one final thought. I may have hated some of them, but I never hated the music. The music was always bigger than the people. In that single line, he captured the paradox of the Opry, an institution built on imperfect humans, yet capable of producing timeless art. And so, his confession didn't tarnish his legacy. If anything, it strengthened it. Bobby Bear remained what he had always been, the outlaw who refused to play by the rules, the storyteller who spoke truths others hid, and the country boy who believed that music should never be fake. At 90, his voice was quieter, but his honesty was louder than ever.